today what I want to do is basically start from where we started more than 100, 120 years ago, and then look at up to about like 1990 or so with the first ECU, the first fully integrated electronic systems. Yeah, so let's look through how we got from one end to the other. So I've put together a few slides. As I said, I'm a chemist. There's one chemical equation and two graphs, but the rest of it's just pictures. All right. So let's start with the basics of what we're trying to do, right? So in our combustion engine, we're sucking in a fuel air mixture and we're exploding it. And to make it extra difficult, this engine isn't running at one speed, right? If it were running at one speed, the airflow would be constant, and you could then set up even something like a drip feed thing and it would work, right? But the issue is the engine speed's changing wildly, the airflow is changing wildly, and we need to somehow get the right fuel air mixture. And you've got this graph where you've got a ratio of 14.7 to 1 is the right mixture for this chemical equation to work perfectly. So basically, all that's saying is oxygen plus octane goes to carbon dioxide and water plus heat. Yeah, and that's really how it works if you do it perfectly. But actually, maximum power is over on the rich side, and maximum economy is on the lean side. So you don't just want to be sitting right here. You want a system that when you put your foot down goes there, and when you're cruising along on a highway sits over here. So that's what you're trying to achieve somehow. And if you dig in deeper, that's actually the same graph, and these different curves are the emissions from the vehicle. So this is your carbon dioxide. So that peaks when you're most efficient, as it would, because you're burning things right. This is your NOx, this is your hydrocarbon, and this is oxygen. So rather complicated, but what you can see is as you go away from this ideal mixture, your emissions go bad. So from a perspective of the environment, you need to try and keep it right. And one thing which is quite important is this oxygen line. So down here, you're burning all the oxygen. But as you get to here and beyond, some of the oxygen in the exhaust is left over. And that turns out to be a critical thing for modern systems. So all your modern cars have got a lambda sensor, an oxygen sensor in the exhaust. And that sensor is measuring that line, because by knowing that, you know where you are in this graph. So that's what modern systems do. They look at that oxygen level, and then they can work out where they are in the mixture, and they can then adjust to suit. So where did we start? The earliest carburetors is a French word which somehow means mixing carbon with air. The Americans say carburetor is a French word meaning do not touch. And that's generally true on a car. Like, carburetors don't just go wrong, and normally your problems are ignition or something else. So the carburetor itself is a relatively rugged device. So these early carburetors, this is from way back when, they were actually bubbling the air through the fuel, so that they had a bucket of fuel, and they were sucking the air through a pipe, and it was like bubbling through the fuel, and therefore there was some evaporation and mixing of the fuel and the air, and the engine would run. But as I said earlier, as the engine speed changes, this bubbling becomes very hard to control. So these early engines, there were lots of controls trying to somehow keep this mixture something like right so that it would work. So it was hugely difficult to actually drive these things, because you were controlling air-fuel ratio by hand as you were driving. And by the early 1900s, the basic carburetor, which you might recognize, was available like as a downdraft or updraft style. And the key breakthrough was the topic in the chat this morning. Clarence sent a picture of Venturi effect. So Venturi effect is if you're sucking air through a pipe and the pipe has got a constriction in it, at that point, the air goes faster to get through the constriction. And when the air is moving faster, the pressure is lower. And so if you put a pipe in the side where that constriction is, it will suck whatever it is out of that pipe. So the basics of a carburetor is exploiting the Venturi effect. You've got a choke, an area of smaller diameter. You've got some form of fuel supply sitting in that area. And as a result, the fuel comes out. And the great thing about that is, as the engine speed changes, the airflow increases, the pressure changes, and therefore it's somehow compensating. So this is the great breakthrough, was exploiting Venturi effect, because then you had a thing that as the airflow changed, the fueling would change, and that's what you want, right? So basics of a carburetor. By the 1950s, we started to see fuel injection in cars. So this is a picture of the first mechanical fuel injection system used on a Mercedes in the 1950s. Quite a complicated device, like a little engine. We'll come back to it later. And then in the 70s, we got first bit of electronics. So the first electronic fuel system, the D-Jetronic from Bosch, the Lucas 6CU, things like that. So yeah, we'll talk a bit about those. And then today, we have a combined thing we call an ECU, right? So in your car, there's a box which is normally about this type of size with a big plug on the side, and that's controlling all the fuel delivery and the ignition. So it's the brain of the car controlling everything. But it is closely related to what went before. So you really see that the organizations which are successful today, you really have got like 100 years of experience in how engines work and how to make things work efficiently. So let's jump into carburetors. Let's start with the Weber. So the Weber is, if I may move over here, this great chunky thing. And these holes here are the chokes. So the air is coming through here, and as you may see, if you look down there, you can see it narrows. Yeah, and so that's the Venturi restriction. And in this diagram here, there's your Venturi restriction, and you see this pipe coming down and the green spraying out. So that's where the fuel, that you can see the pipes in there, that's where the fuel sprays out. And interestingly on these, they don't just have on some carburetors, you have a jet where you've got neat fuel at the point where the fuel is sprayed into the airstream. But on these, they've got, if I can get it out, they've got an emulsion system up there in this diagram. So this is the jet, and actually the fuel is coming in at the bottom, and some of the air is mixing with the fuel in this thing. So it's the same pressure as in there, and it's sucking the fuel, and it's mixing the fuel and the air in this thing, and then it's being delivered down this green tube and sprayed into the airflow. So if you know anything about Webers, everybody's talking about jetting. Jetting is everything, and this is the jet. And by changing the size of these holes, you're changing how much air and how much fuel mixed together. So this is what all of the tuning specialists for years have been doing, is understanding, if I change these holes, what effects it's going to have on the mixture of the system. And these work really well at quite high engine speeds. So once you're at 2,000 RPM plus, these things work pretty good. But down at idle, they struggle because there isn't enough suck, there isn't enough airflow, and they really struggle to deliver the fuel. And that's why they've got some additional features. They've got an idle jet and some progression tubes. So again, when the car's idling, the throttle is pretty much closed. There's a little bit of air coming across the top and the bottom. And so on the top of the carburetor, here, you've got a screw which bleeds in some extra fuel by the traditional way. So this is like neat fuel coming in. So this is your idle jet. So to make the car idle well, you need to get that right. And then as you come off idle, it can misbehave a little bit, not be happy. And so by controlling the progression drillings here, you get a little bit of fuel just as it comes off. So you can see it's already quite a complicated thing. The principle is simple, but actually to get it to work over all engine speeds is already tough. And then you can add the complication of cold starting. Yeah. And there's an extra system on these to add extra fuel so that the car will start cold. And then go back to that graph. When you put your foot down, you want it to suddenly go rich. Yeah, that gives you the most power. And that is the injection. Sorry, that is the accelerator pump, which I'm trying to look for on these, but normally it's on the bottom. I don't think these have them. So normally you've got another simple diaphragm pump. When you put your foot down, it presses a lever and it just squirts in a bit of extra fuel, gives you that richer mixture so the car accelerates cleanly. So you've got a bunch of additional things which already make this quite a complicated carburetor. And that's why tuning these things is quite an art, right? To actually get these to work. And this is one of those things which is really dying out. The people who understand how these work and how to tune them, there are really not many people left who really understand them. And if you thought that was bad, then look at this bad boy. So this is a Solex of a Mercedes. It's a Pierberg, not a Solex. It's a multi-barrel carburetor. So it's got a slow running and a high speed section. So this bit is a slow running. So when you're driving around town, you're using this. And if you look down there, it looks a little bit like that Weber looks like. Similar style, similar arrangement. But when you really put your foot down, this side opens up, and this is just a big hole with a big pipe in it. Yeah, so this adds loads of fuel so that the car will really, really perform at high speed. And it's got a slow running and a fast running section. The reason there's double is just for capacity in this particular case. And all of these, this is the accelerator pump, for instance, similar accelerator pump. This is the cold start. I don't know what this is, but it's probably something to do with keeping the idle correct under certain circumstances. So you can see the simple carburetor has turned into this beast, right? And understanding this thing is super tough. Yeah, okay, you can actually see the throttles underneath, and I think I can operate it. Yeah, so first of all those. So as I put my foot down, they open, and then when I really put my foot down, the other side opens, see? And that's how this thing is working. And the worst thing for any carburetor is dirty fuel. Because inside this thing, there's lots of little passageways, yeah? And if it gets dirty fuel once, then half those passageways are blocked up, and then you really struggle to make this thing work. The other thing which I don't like, especially with modern fuels, is being stored. So if you keep a car for 3 years and then try and start it, with modern fuels, often there's a lot of corrosion inside this thing. Now, really, my experience when I was a kid messing about with cars, you could have a car which had sat for 10 years, and with a bit of new fuel, it would just go. It would start and run. But now, after 4 or 5 years, you look inside, all the blast parts have gone green, everything's corroded. So the fuel has changed, and as a result, if you store a car many years, the carburetor gets gummed up and needs an overhaul before it will work again. So, yeah, it's good to keep them running now and again. Yeah, so I listed all the different functions of this thing. So there's a list of 32 different features inside this lump, right? So it's hugely complex. I won't go into the detail. And then I'll come on to the SU, because that's the one which more of us tinker with. And it's a different type of carburetor, and it's actually quite simple. So those carburetors we just talked about were fixed choke designs. That's why you got the multiple flaps and things like that. The choke is a fixed size. And so as the airflow varies, the pressure changes. The SU carb works a different way. Let me go on to the next picture first. The carburetor is called a constant depression carburetor. It is a variable choke design. And so this green part is a piston with a needle in the end of it, and this is the jet. And as the airflow changes, this area forms the choke, but this piston has got the pressure engine side above it and the pressure atmospheric the other. So as the engine sucks more, the pressure here drops, this piston moves up, yeah? And so it reaches a state where the pressure in this area is the same no matter what the engine speed is. Yeah, so it's a constant depression. So the pressure stays the same. The choke changes in size with engine speed. And so the great thing about the SU design is, okay, now the pressure's the same, and I've got a measure of how much air is passing through, because I know how high this piston is. So when this piston is down, it's obviously not much air flowing. When this piston is up, there's obviously a lot of air flowing. So now I need to add the right amount of fuel in those different conditions. And the way I do that is with a tapered needle. So this is the jet, there's fuel in here. And at the top of that needle, it's like a little donut area of jet, yeah? And as the car goes faster, the more airflow, the piston rises up, and the donut area increases in area, and so more fuel comes out. So you can match the fuel with the airflow just by changing the shape of this needle. Yeah, it's a nice, simple thing. So it works very well, and the SU carburetors and the Stromberg CD series carburetors, they use the same method. Right, so the interesting point about when they're working is that under steady state condition, different engine speeds, the pressure's the same, even though the piston's in a different position. Now it gets a bit more complicated because, again, you want some enrichment when you put your foot down. So how do I make sure that I get a richer mixture when I want to accelerate? And I also have to deal with the fact that the engine is not sucking constantly. As the valves open, there's pulses of pressure. And so this piston could like flap up and down, and that wouldn't be good. So here's an actual SU carburetor, and in the top, there's a damper. So this is an oil-filled tube with a little blast part in it. It goes in there, and it's just a damper. So all it's there for is to stop the fast vibration of the piston caused by the pulses of pressure from the engine. And then to deal with the acceleration enrichment, you've got both that damper and there's a spring in here. So that spring is trying to push the piston down. Yeah. So when you accelerate, the damper and the spring resist the piston going up. So for that moment, it's no longer constant depression. So now the air's got to flow through that small space. It's going to take some time for the piston to rise up. And whilst it's flowing through the small space, the pressure drops because it has to move faster, back to the basic principle. So it sucks more fuel out. So you've got the enrichment caused by the fact that you restrict the choke when the airflow changes and accelerate. So all the features, not all the features, of this beast fixed Venturi, fixed choke carburetors are all in this simple thing, which is just a piston and a jet and a spring. Yeah, so they are nice and simple, and nothing is particularly tiny. So in other words, us engineers, we can get in there and not cause any trouble. It's a relatively simple thing. And that's the basics of how they work. Because the jet is so big, they're also quite resistant to bad fuel because it will come out the jet. Okay, it goes into your engine, which is not so good, but it won't block the jet because the jet is a big thing and the jet's got a moving needle in it, and so it can clear itself quite easily. She's just a piston and a jet. All of these carburetors have got a float chamber where you've got a reservoir of fuel which is kept at a specific height. So go back to the basics of this Venturi and this jet. In this carburetor, if you take this assembly off as we've done, and everything else is in place, and you look down, you can just see the top of the fuel levels sitting down there. So down on that brass ring down there, the fuel level is just there. Yeah. Now, if the fuel level were higher, then it would start to just drip out of this hole automatically, and so the carburetor wouldn't work right. And of course, if the fuel level was lower, then you're going to have to suck a lot harder to get the fuel out. So the float chamber is an important thing because it's setting effectively the pressure of the fuel in the jet. Yeah. And these types of carburetors do suffer from that same debris causing there's a little needle valve. It's a little bit like a toilet cistern. So it's basically a float and a valve, and it fills up whenever the level drops. But that little valve can get debris on it and stick, and then it will overflow. And normally you see the overflow just running down here. Yeah. My advice, if it overflows, is don't take it apart. Just get a reasonable piece of wood and give it a whack. Yeah. And often just giving it a whack, give it a bit of a vibration, will clear it without you taking it all apart. So, of course, don't hit it with a hammer because you'll smash it. Yeah. But a bit of wood, give it a whack, and it will clear. The top. Right, so there's one with the top on, right? And it's got a little hole down there. So the fuel goes in there, beneath there's a little bleed hole, and so if the float or the needle sticks, you start to see fuel coming out of that hole, and it floods down there. So
just knock this area.
Right. So give that a knock, and if the thing dries out, you fixed it.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So so they're relatively rugged, and we can go in there and service them. So over time, this piston assembly gets a bit dirty. Even if we look in this one, yeah, it's not bad, but often you'll find it's dirty in here. So it just needs a clean, which you can easily do, and that can help it work again. And the key thing, of course, is to be quite careful with this needle. Yeah. So if this needle gets bent, it won't work properly. If this needle's dirty, it won't work properly. And the needle should go into the center of the jet. It shouldn't rub against the side. If it does rub against the side, over time it wears the needle, and that changes the mixture, right? So then the mixture's not right. Of course, you can replace the needle if you need to. And just like with Weber jetting, SU needles. Oh yeah, here's a float. SU needles. There's thousands of different needles for different cars and different tunes, and there's various websites where you can look up. Each needle's has got a 2-letter code. I seem to remember for my cars SM and TW. So you can look up your needle, and then you can find a needle which is a little bit thinner or fatter, and try that if you want to try tuning for different situations. Oh look, and this is here's our float chamber. So as I said, just like a toilet system, there's a little needle valve in there, and it sits at what should be the perfect height, and sometimes the needle valve sticks open and this overflows, and then it comes out. Comes out there. So this looks like new. Wow. Okay. So carburetors through the 1920s, 1930s, carburetors ruled. That's all there was. Everything was great. In the build-up to the Second World War, the German Air Ministry especially recognized that carburetors are not much good in an aeroplane. Just as I said about this float chamber, it's actually relying on gravity to work, right? So if I get into a 0G situation, this float doesn't float anymore. So the control of the fuel in the float chamber in an aircraft, which is pulling different Gs, turns out to be incredibly difficult. And so the German Air Ministry specified in the mid-1930s that all future aircraft engines must use fuel injection. And so a number of companies in Germany started to develop mechanical fuel injection technology. Of course, fuel injection existed already for diesel engines. So for diesel engines, it had been around for some time. But to make it work for petrol engines has got its own challenges. And interestingly, the British did not do that. So they stuck with carburetors. When the fuel is in the jet is being sprayed into the airstream, another bit of chemistry happens, which is it's cooling the charge. So just like when you sweat, your skin gets wet, and as it evaporates, it cools you. As you spray fuel into the air, it evaporates in the airstream, in the carburetor, and that cools the air. And as a result, the fuel-air mixture going into the engine is cooler. and that means you get more in, because if the gas is cooler, it's lower volume, so you get more charge into the cylinder and therefore more power. Yeah, so these are important factors in designing an engine, and the British felt that the charge cooling of a carburetor was more valuable than injection, because you don't get any charge cooling with injection, because you're injecting straight into the cylinder in this case. They were wrong. So the Second World War started, and the Germans soon realized that a Spitfire would not perform in a dive, because as soon as you dive the Spitfire, the carburetor would flood, the mixture would go rich, the engine would stall. Yeah, and so the only way for a Spitfire to dive at the start of the Second World War was to flip it over. So they had to flip over and dive upside down so that their carburetor still worked. Yeah, and so this was a serious thing. Yeah, so the enemy will always identify your weak point, and that was it. And so the British, at a late stage, found ways to make the carburetor work better under those conditions. So they introduced some restrictors in the float chamber, so that when the zero-G moment happened, it took some time for it to flood. It still flooded eventually, but it just took longer to flood, and that gave you enough time to do your dive and get out of it before things went bad. So, yeah, fuel injection was superior. And two important engines in Germany which had fuel injection was the V12, which is in the Messerschmitt 109, and that was a Bosch fuel injection system, and the radial engine, which was in the Focke-Wulf 190, and that was made by a company called Deckel, and there's some schematics of their injections. I'll jump straight in here. Post-war, Bosch had this injection technology, and as their post-war cars developed, they introduced it on the 300 SL, I think in 54, yeah, something like that. So this was the first commercial application of fuel injection in a motor car, and they did it for reasons of power. Right? So this engine was more flexible, more powerful than its carburetor. The other versions of the car with the carburetor. And interestingly, because it's become popular again in the last 10 years, this was what's called gasoline direct injection. So this was injecting the fuel. You know, with a carburetor, we're mixing the fuel and air in the manifold, in the inlet before the valve, and then we're sucking the mixture into the combustion chamber. What this was doing, it was sucking air into the combustion chamber, and once the valve had closed, it was injecting the fuel straight into the combustion chamber. This is what diesel engines do, and it requires very high pressure. So it's like 10,000 psi or something, because you remember the piston's coming up, you're compressing the mixture inside you're compressing the air inside the cylinder, and you've got to inject against that. So you need very high pressure to do it. It was a success, but it had a reputation for being noisy because of these pulses, these pulses of 10,000 psi fuel. This engine, there was a lot of rattling noise. You know, a diesel engine has got a very characteristic noise, right? And that is, a lot of that noise is the injection system. Right. Let me just dive in here to show you a little bit about how that works. So now back to the fundamentals. How do I mix my fuel and air in the correct ratio? Yeah. So now I've got a mechanical pump which can pump in fuel. But how much fuel to pump and how to control that? So the way these things work, is they measure the pressure in the manifold. So when the throttle is closed and the engine's trying to suck, there's a very low pressure in the manifold. Yeah. And as you open the throttle, the air comes in more easily. The pressure in the manifold rises. So manifold pressure is a key signal of how much air is coming into the engine. And that's actually how modern injection systems work. All modern injection systems have got a manifold pressure sensor. So these systems measure it mechanically. There's a pipe from the manifold to these pumps, and they've got some diaphragm system in, and they've got a wedge-shaped device which transmits mechanically information about the manifold pressure. And then there's a little piston inside this pump which is going up and down, and the piston has got you can just see it here, has got a spiral groove in the side of it, and the cylinder has got a hole in the side of it. And in this pump, just like a diesel pump, there's a rack, and each cylinder has got a little gear on it. And so with that information about manifold pressure, you're pushing this rack backwards and forwards. And as you push that rack backwards and forwards, you twist that cylinder. And so if you can imagine, as the little piston comes down, it fills with fuel completely, and that is the full power amount of fuel. And then this cylinder is rotated to align with that spiral groove. And so as the piston comes up with the fuel in it, the fuel leaks down the spiral groove and comes out that hole until the spiral and the hole no longer align. Yeah. And then the rest of the fuel is ejected. So if you can imagine, the way it works is each injection pulse is initially full fuel, and then you bleed off the fuel based upon the manifold pressure to inject just a little bit for high manifold pressure, low manifold pressure. Diesel engines do the same. So generally speaking, if a diesel pump stops working, it's because this rack thing has jammed up. Yeah. So it can also jam in the other direction on full throttle. And with a diesel engine, that's very dangerous because the engine will just run away and explode. So, yeah, but it's quite precision technology. I come on to my favorite, which is the Kugelfischer pump, which was fitted in the Peugeots, BMWs, Fords, Ferraris, and things. So this pump, so that Bosch pump we just looked at is like a directly came from Bosch's work on the aero engines in the war. This pump can trace its history back to that Focke-Wulf engine. So the guys who developed the injection for the BMW radial after the war, they were thinking also, how can we bring this into the car world? And they recognized that the problem with the Bosch system was it was mechanically too precise, too complicated. It was expensive. It would never be mass market. And so these guys attempted to find a way to make it cheaper. And the neat way that they did it was do away with this rack and spiral and the cylinder with the hole in it, and they just varied the amount of fuel in each little piston by adjusting the stroke. So in an engine, the stroke is normally fixed, right? So as the piston comes down, the amount of air we suck in an engine is the same every time, right? So what they did in this case is they they have a little piston which is for the injection, which is going up and down, and they're adjusting the stroke. So at low speeds, the stroke is small, just pumps in a little bit, and at high speed, the stroke is big and it pumps in a lot. And they found a way to do that, which was relatively cheap to manufacture, much less precise moving parts, and therefore more suited to mass market. It came, as I said, it came to the market in the 60s for initially Peugeot, and then it was used later in the BMWs. And interestingly, it ended up on a Formula One engine. So Formula One engines of the mid-1980s, not a mistake, mid-1980s, were using these pumps for the injection because they turn out to be super reliable. Yeah, and for F1 engine, you need the ability to deliver precision injection, and of course reliability. So this is the head of the pump. Fuel goes in here, and injection pulses come out here. And these are the little pistons. So it's a simple piston on a spring, and they're just pushed up and down. And the way the system works is that's the full stroke, and what it does is it limits how far this piston can come down. So this is the sucking in fuel, and this is the injection. Yeah, and so the way the system works is if I limit how far this piston can come down, then it's got less fuel for the next injection pulse. And then inside the pump body, there's a cam. I don't know whether you can see that turning down there. There's a cam, and that's moving these little pistons the same each time. And this plate is what's, as I said, you need to restrict how far those pistons come down. It's done with this plate. Yeah. Okay, so now I need to control the height of this plate. So the height of this plate controls the mixture, basically. That's the way it works. And I do that with this funny looking cone. So this thing, it's not in the engine. It's free to rotate about 270 degrees, and this plate has got a little nub on it, which rubs along this piston. Sorry, along this cone, and so this cone is a fuel map. So the highest point here is idle. When this sits on this shaft with this lever underneath, and when I press the throttle, I pull this piston back. So the little nub on that plate you saw earlier, it goes from sitting on this high point to sitting down here because this moves, yeah, and so it delivers more fuel. And this thing responds to throttle position and is also driven by a mechanism connected to engine speed. So as the engine speeds up, it rotates like this. So this is engine speed direction. This is throttle position, and this funny looking shape, when you first see it, it looks like it's got mangled in some way. This is a precise map of the fuel requirements for that particular engine. Yeah. So this is from a BMW. It won't work in a Peugeot. Yeah. And I read recently about McLaren developing the BMW 320 in the very late 70s for touring car racing, and Kugelfischer sent them a chart where for their engine, they had to fill in the fuel requirements at certain revs and what the pressure was. So they needed to provide information on the manifold pressure, the fuel requirement, and then from that, Kugelfischer made them a cone which they could put in their pump, which is their fuel map. So quite an incredible thing. And this cone is actually much bigger than the way the Bosch pump works. It doesn't use a cone; it uses just a simple, call it two-dimensional ramp. It doesn't have the same three-dimensional approach. So these pumps, by comparison with the Bosch pumps, were quite simple, a lower cost, and therefore got more mainstream use. And in this time, Bosch and others were learning a lot about how to make engines run right. If I can now control the injection pulse so accurately, how can I make these engines run much better? They were learning a lot. As you know, I've got a BMW 2002 turbo. Part of the reason that BMW were the first to launch a European turbo was because they had injection. So in a normal engine situation with a camshaft, you've got this point of overlap. So you've got a situation where the inlet valve is just opening and the exhaust valve hasn't closed yet, right? It's called overlap. And you're doing that because you want to maximize the filling with the clean fuel mixture. But if I now pressurize the inlet with a turbo, when I've got overlap, I'm just blowing straight through and out the other side. Yeah, so I'm blowing unburnt mixture out the exhaust, which is a no-no. You can't do that. But with this pump, I can time the injection. So the exhaust valve is still open, and at that point, I'm just blowing in air. And then as the exhaust valve closes, then I can, with the cam shape, I can start to inject the fuel, and that way I can ensure that no fuel goes out the exhaust. So with the mechanical system, I can time the injection with the valves of the engine in such a way that I can efficiently and without any side effects get the fuel into a turbo. Yeah, and one of the great things that these pumps can do. And so by the 1980s, in those F1 engines, they still had this inside. They're still exactly the same, but instead of, this is driven by, this rotation is done by engine speed in the standard pumps. But for the F1 engines, they actually had a servo motor on the back, and they had a computer. And so they were controlling this rotation with a computer. But the injection itself was still done like it had been done in the 1960s, 20 years earlier, and with technology which had been developed in the 1930s for military applications. So quite an interesting thing. Now, I won't go into the details here. We just talked about it. Another one which you may have heard of, Speaker. Speaker is an Italian one. It was used on a bunch of the Spiders and other cars. Yeah, right. So this is also a rack-based system. Yeah, it's somewhat similar in design to how the Bosch system works, and it's got it's using a centrifugal engine speed governor system. Yeah, so that's another one. I actually don't know much about these ones, but the principles are the same. It's measuring manifold pressure, it's measuring engine speed, it's adjusting. This one's also using the spiral groove approach. And another one you may have heard of is the Lucas system, which was used on the Ford DFV in Formula One in the late 60s and early 70s. And was also used on Triumph TR5, various Aston Martins, things like that. So this system is different again because you're not generating the pressure in the pump. That this thing is actually a distributor. So this distributor is able to adjust the amount of fuel depending on manifold pressure and engine speed, but the fuel pressure itself is generated by a high pressure pump. So there's no pressure buildup in this pump. It's just distributing and adjusting the pulse width of the fuel injection. These pumps, they were pretty successful in their period. This advert here, I don't know if we can zoom into the ad. Yeah. So yeah, this was the race car injection system of the 1960s. So they were quite popular. It turns out these pumps, their design, they were very sensitive to the lubrication in the fuel. And as we went to unleaded fuel, the lubricity of the fuel dropped. And it turns out these pumps had lots of problems in the 1980s and 1990s because of lubrication weaknesses. Yeah. So we switched to mechanical fuel injection because if you do it right, you've got this precision. You can, for a given engine situation, you can accurately inject fuel in a way that you couldn't control as well with a carburetor. So that gives you improved efficiency. These cars have got better miles per gallon. They perform better. They're more powerful. And because you're controlling that mixture, back on that chart at the start, you're controlling the mixture better, the emissions are better. Yeah. So a win everywhere, but it's more expensive. Right? It's more expensive than a carburetor. And ultimately, mass market automotive is driven by cost. And so you only really saw this on performance models. It never really got into mass market because of the cost structure. That's why beasts like this existed in the 1980s and 1990s, because that's, believe it or not, that's cheaper than an injection system. And then electronic happened. Am I doing all right for time? Also, as a result of defense development. So, first of all, you need to develop injectors. You need an injector in a electronic injection system is a solenoid valve. Ultimately, it's some form of solenoid valve. You need to know where in the cycle the engine is, so you can do that like your distributor is doing that. Actually, your distributor knows the cycle, and that's why it's sparking the right cylinder at the right time. So some early systems of electronic injection still use a distributor, but unfortunately, between the crankshaft, which is really important, and the distributor, you've normally got a chain and a gear, and so actually there's a lot of slop between those two. So the accuracy of a distributor is limited by the mechanical tolerances from the crankshaft. So the best thing to do is measure the crankshaft position directly, because that's telling you where the piston is, and that's what's important in controlling an engine. So all electronic systems use some form of crank sensing to know where the pistons are. And then you need to measure airflow. One way to do that is the manifold pressure we talked about. Another way to do it is two ways, using a flap system. So the top system there is just like a hinged door with a potentiometer stuck to it. So as the air sucks through faster, the door opens, and you can record that electrically, so you can know how much air is going through by how far the doors open. That's how the top one works. And the other one at the bottom is hot wire. Hot wire is a little bit more complicated. Imagine if I had a hot wire and I blow it. When I blow on it, I cool it down, so the resistance changes. So if I have a piece of wire and I power it like a light bulb filament, so it's hot, and I measure the resistance, as the airflow changes, I'm blowing on it and it gets colder, and the resistance changes. So by measuring that resistance change, I can measure airflow. So these are two ways you can measure airflow. These systems are quite rugged. These ones are a little bit delicate. So if you drop that thing, you will break the wire and then you need a new one. So different ways you can measure airflow in an electronic system. Or you can do it using manifold pressure. I show this because some of you may remember this. In cars of the 60s, you often had this additional gauge you could add, which was your like economy gauge. That's also measuring manifold pressure. So by looking at what the pressure is in the manifold, you can tell when you're slowing down, idling, drive. Pour is like full power. So this is giving you some idea about the efficiency of your engine just by measuring the pressure. And the modern systems to measure pressure are small electronic devices or electromechanical devices. And then, as I mentioned with this cone, this is a fuel map. This is a map, engine speed versus throttle position, telling me how much fuel I need. And any modern injection system has also got a map, but it's stored electronically. It's just an example I picked off the internet. So this is throttle position, speed, engine speed, and manifold pressure. So, amount of fuel. So this is telling you electronically how much fuel I need for a given situation. So what the computer is doing is it's monitoring these two bits of information. It's looking where on the graph that means it needs to be, and then it's instructing the fuel injector to squirt for that long. Now, the early system was developed by Bendix, and Bendix developed it because under military contract, they had developed electronic fuel injection for Korean War aircraft. So the last of the piston engines in Korean War aircraft used Bendix injection systems, which were electronic. Now, these were analog electronic using discrete components, no integrated circuits back then. It was just analog components. And those early electronic components were not very stable. And that meant, especially in engine bay temperatures, these electronic systems drifted quite quickly. Now, in military application, that's okay. I just put a new one in every 3 months. But in a car, it's a problem. So they launched this in '57, and Chrysler and AMC introduced it. But it was so bad that after a year or two, they recalled the cars and switched them back to carburetors because it was just not reliable. So they were really too early trying to do it. And the key thing for the future of injection and engine management systems, they really gave up and they sold the IP to Bosch. Yeah, and so this is a key point. So Bosch, which had made various automotive components in the past, saw the future with electronic systems, and so they bought the intellectual property from Bendix and carried on with it. Another one which you probably haven't heard of is this company Brico. They also were developing injection technology based on the Bendix system, and it was due for the Series 3 E-Type. So the Jaguar V12 was designed to have fuel injection from day one. And very late in the development of the Jag V12, this company pulled out, went broke. There's some story there about Rolls-Royce went broke because of the development of the jet engine, the RB211. Remember, Rolls-Royce split, the automotive and the aerospace split. So they were owed money by Rolls-Royce. So when Rolls-Royce went bust, they ran out of money, and so they gave up. So there are a few Aston Martin DB6s, I think, DB6 and Ferraris with this system. But the big launch was going to be the Jag V12, and then at a late stage it couldn't happen, and they also switched back to carburetors, at least for a few years. So you see the first two companies which tried to make electronic injection work failed, because it's not so easy. But finally Bosch got it working, and the first commercially successful one was D-Jetronic. D, Druck, pressure. So this system measures manifold pressure to adjust the fueling. So it knows the engine speed, it knows the manifold pressure, it's got that map we talked about, it can adjust the fueling. But you can see all these components inside, so it's a relatively complex, it's still what they call analog electronic system. And Lucas then took that to develop their first injection system, which was used in the Jag V12 in the XJS. Right? The XJS has got Lucas 4CU, I think, which is the early electronic injection system, which is a derivative of the Bosch system. Yeah, so the reason that Bosch wanted to do this is cheaper than those mechanical systems, right? Because you just need a few sensors, an electronic box, and a few injectors, and you're ready to roll. So from a cost perspective, this was a winner for the automotive industry. Yeah, that's a close-up of the box. Now, a very common one, it's called K-Jetronic, but actually it's not electronic. So this is a very popular system used on many Mercedes, BMW, European cars. But actually this is a mechanical system. It's got a bunch of electronic add-ons to improve it, but the basic system is a mechanical one, and this is a continuous injection one. So everything we've talked about so far has been trying to inject in time with the engine in some form of synchronized way. Could be what they call fully sequential. I actually do every cylinder when it's necessary. But more common was batch fire. I fire once or twice in each engine cycle for different cylinders. But this is just continuous. The injectors are just spraying all the time. And the amount they spray is controlled by this flap. So this is also a flap in the airflow. So as you open the throttle, the flap moves. There's some levers. And inside this box here is a metering system which adjusts the way the fuel flows through. So it's a little bit like the Lucas system in terms of it's distributing the fuel and it's controlling the pressure of fuel to the injectors. But it's even though it's called Jetronic in the name, there's no tronic there. And then L-Jetronic. So L-Jetronic was another system which was very popular in the 1980s and even into the 1990s, and that used the flap thing that we talked about. So this has got a box which is about this type of size, which is connected to the air filter, and that's measuring airflow for the system. And it's called L-Jetronic because it's measuring the air, Luft in German. So D-Jet was Druck, pressure. K-Jet is, I can't pronounce it, continuous. L-Jet is Luft, air. So the letters do mean something. And this was still analog electronics, but because of the development of the electronics industry, this had the first custom integrated circuits in it. So it had custom ICs, which enabled it to do that job better. Oh, sorry, I've gone too quick. I want to go back one slide. And then from the L-Jetronic, Bosch created the thing called Motronic, and that's the first ECU. So that is the first. Let me just go back a bit. With L-Jet, I have a 1985 Alpha Spider, which has got L-Jetronic, but it's actually got two computers. So it's got one computer for fuel and another one for ignition. So there's a separate computers, they talk to each other a little bit, but they're actually quite separate. And that's how they were doing it in the mid-80s. And then slightly later, Bosch combined them all in one box. So they brought the ignition control and the fuel control into one box. They called it Motronic. And that's the first ECU, which is the thing all of our cars today are using, derivatives of that. And of course, now they're digital. So they were analog electronics, now they're digital electronics. And that means, you've got quite a computer in your car, which is looking at that surface I talked about, responding to different sensors and different conditions, and adjusting the fueling. Which brings me to the end, right? So what I tried to show here is how fuel economy has changed. The major reason fuel economy has improved over those 100 years is the transition from carburetors to injection to electric fuel injection to ECUs. And you see fuel economy has gone from 15 miles per gallon up to 40 plus over 100 years. And that's not entirely, but significantly due to the improvements in fuel injection and carburation. Yeah, so that's it. That's an interesting history of how we got where we are. And the important point for me is it's not like anybody turned up overnight, right? So you see these companies like Bosch, they've been working on this since 1935, yeah? And so that's why they're in a dominant position today, because they've got nearly 100 years experience of understanding what's needed. And you see a bunch of guys try to turn up and do things, Bendix, Brico, and things didn't work out for them. Yeah, and of course, Bosch now makes many of those key components. The obvious one, the oxygen sensors. Primarily Bosch make those. Yeah, so they've developed the technologies they needed to go along with their ECUs. Yeah, so I hope that's a quick overview.
One quick question, we are talking about European carburetors, whereas how about the Japanese automobile? They also have their own set of carburetors.
Right, but they were
all the same copy here and there.
Exactly. So a lot of them were made under license or blatant copy. So a lot of the carburetors you see on the 60s and 70s Japanese cars are right. So they're something like a Weber. I don't think it's a licensed thing. I think it's just a copy, technological copy of the.
They just reverse engineering.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Even the SU and the Stromberg. The reason for Strombergs is there was enough demand for carburetors that Stromberg could copy the SU principle without conflicting with their IP. So a Stromberg has got a piston going up and down, but it's got a rubber diaphragm and some other bits and bobs in it. So it's a reverse engineered copy of an SU. Actually, it works quite fine, but it's a copy. And then if you look at the early fuel injection in the Japanese cars, that's licensed from Bosch. And actually, the parts for the Japanese systems will fit the Bosch cars, not all, but some. So that it really is a licensed copy. Of course, I didn't talk much about American carburetors, and there's other injection systems like the Rochester system, which is used in race cars and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of other stuff. I just covered maybe the European view of how these things develop.
Yeah. True, they always say that the SU is the best carburetor.
Yeah,
easy to repair, easy to maintain.
Right, I think it's easy. But it's not the best, and over the years it got more and more complicated. So this is a basic SU, very simple, and then this other one we looked at, it's got a different thing here. This is called the wax stat. So this was the first attempt to try and compensate for temperature. So now the jet moves up and down slightly as the carburetor gets hot. It's like a wax thermostat in the bottom here. So they tried to make it a little bit responsive to different temperatures.
Actually, the engine there has the wax that you can see.
Yeah.
But if they only designed the manifold not close to the carburetor, that would have helped, right?
Well, okay, and they attempted to fix it with this. So this is all still an SU, but this is what they call HIF, integrated float chamber. So the float chamber, instead of being hanging on the side, is now integrated underneath. Yeah. So they got more complicated with time as they tried to keep up with, especially emissions. Right, emissions got more and more difficult to meet emission standards. And most of the cars that went to the US, they stopped using SUs and they went to the Strombergs, because the Strombergs could be set and stabilized more reliably. So once you set up once you set up a Stromberg, they actually sealed the adjustment screws, and as long as you didn't touch it, it would stay where it was. So SUs need a little bit more tinkering, but they're ultimately pretty bomb-proof, right? And that's what makes them the favourite. But I don't agree. People swapping Strombergs for SUs, I personally think that's a ridiculous thing. That from the functional perspective, they're identical. Actually, they work almost identically the same. So, yeah.
We've got a question from the chat. Would a fuel injection car run hotter versus a similar carburation?
No, because the majority, going back to what I said about charge cooling, virtually all the injection we've talked about has been port injection. So that charge cooling has been happening. Actually, engine temperature depends on mixture. So as the mixture goes leaner, engine runs hotter. That's why if your engine runs lean for too much, you will melt the pistons, because it runs hotter and eventually the pistons will melt. Engine runs hotter if the ignition is retarded. So if the ignition occurs later in the cycle, the lesser the energy is pushing the piston down, and more of it is just burning on the way out, and that means that the engine runs hotter. So if your car's running hot, I would check mixture, check timing, right? So advance the timing, it will run cooler. Richen the mixture up, it will run cooler. And go back to the F1 cars. They really played games with that. They injected loads of fuel in. They were running crazy boosts on small engines, and to stop them blowing up, they were injecting far too much fuel just because of its cooling effect. Yeah, so they were really trying to cool the engine just using the fuel. Terrible for fuel consumption, but better than nothing. So I don't think injection is fundamentally affecting the overall performance of the engine in terms of temperature or anything else. I think it's probably better controlled, not worse.
In terms of more power for a car, why was the Weber's more looked upon as a better system for getting more power, extracting more power?
Yeah, so to get more power, you need to get more air in, or more air and fuel in the right ratio in, right? And a Weber on full throttle, you can see straight through, right? So they're slightly less restrictive than an SU, where you've got this piston in a way which the air has got to move that up, right? So there's an SU is a bit more restrictive than a Weber is, so that's one reason. But a lot of it is to do with top end fueling. So you need to get enough fuel in to get the maximum power. And there, the great thing about the Webers is with those jets, you've got massive flexibility to change those jets to make sure you can get the high power fueling. Normally at the expense of the low running, so it'll go great at 6,000 RPM, but it won't idle. Okay, but if you want power, then a lot of people have focused on that. The other thing which controls engine power is cam lift and cam overlap, those two things. With carburetors, as you increase the lift and overlap, you start to get the air moving backwards and forwards in the inlet manifold at certain times, and the carburetors simply don't like it. So if you run high overlap, high lift cams with carburetors, they don't idle well at all. But by comparison, injection can handle that. So again, given my own experience with the BMW 2002, so you can put wilder cams in the injected cars, and they can still idle nicely and progress nicely. If you do it with Webers, then sure, you can get the same maximum power, but the car just won't idle right, because of not just the jetting, but also the weird airflow when you've got lots of overlap in the cam. So yeah, and of course now it's got super easy with your ECU, because you want more fuel, you just change the chip, and you know, a lot of people do that, and you know, cars for homologation. There are cases in the past where, you know, they have to produce a certain number of cars for production in order to qualify for the race series. They call it homologation. If I produce, say, 250 cars, I'm allowed to go racing with the same car. And those homologation cars have often got extra injectors which are not actually used in the road car because they want to use them in the race car. And so they have to sell 250 with the same configuration. So if you buy one of these cars, again, if you change the ECU, you can get that extra injector working and you suddenly get a big boost in power. So, yeah, many games to play with the electronic systems. And these days, yeah, those electronic systems are able to continuously adjust themselves. So even hobby standards. So there's a hobby injection system called Mega Squirt. You can go look it up, and basically you can do it yourself at home. You can, you know, create some sensors, put some injectors in, and then these things come with a base map. So you put the base map into the computer, the engine will run, and then you drive it, and it learns. So you have your laptop connected, and as you drive, it sees what's going on, and then it adjusts itself to improve. So you don't need to take it to a rolling road. You don't need to be a injection expert. The software will adjust the car to make it run under all conditions. Yeah, incredible what you can do.
Is the software reading the same kind of variables that you were just explaining about, manifold pressure?
Yep, exactly the same. Exactly the same.
Exhaust.
Like, so you're measuring exhaust oxygen, exhaust temperature, inlet pressure, throttle position, crank position, cam position. Yeah, and then you got the information you need to do the right injection. And of course, the other thing which these late ECUs have got, they've got onboard diagnostics at the requirement of the US government. So go back to that L-Jetronic system, my car with the two computers. When that car goes wrong, yeah, you're really on your own, right? Because there's no information about what's happened, and you've just got to start changing things to work out what the hell happened. And the US government realized this was a huge problem, and so they mandated onboard diagnostics. So there was a standard plug, and you could plug into the computer and it would tell you what was wrong. And that's now standard on all vehicles. So all vehicles are reporting which sensor's gone bad or what they don't like.
So because of the US?
It was driven by US mandate, yeah, because of the problems they got into with, you know, you just have to replace everything at random until the problem goes away.
We get the best of both worlds. What do you think?
Yes. You know, it depends how much you embrace the electronics, right? So agree, it's difficult to understand, and a distributor is like a trusted technology we can get our head around. But if you look, all cars have gone to coil packs, right? So instead of having one coil and a distributor to distribute the sparks, you now have a coil on each plug. Yeah. And so you just signal to each plug what you want to fire. These progressions, the car guys are not crazy. They're doing this for economic and performance reasons. So if you understand these systems, that they are capable of being better. But you're right, there's a degree of complexity there, which we didn't used to have, right? So you used to be able to carry a bit of sandpaper in your pocket and clean your points, and now you need to carry a small computer and read your diagnostic code. So, yeah, things have changed.
So it's good to your points car, then it's good to have a set of points when you're traveling long distance. The last one, So good to have points, or you have the electronic ignition, it's just a plug and play thingy, so you just bring one set along with you. But to be fair, I actually like it to be separate because, for example, I have friends who ask me when there's some problems, when there's a firing problem, right? It can be as simple as your distributor cap crack, and just by taking out your spark plug, you can see which one is problematic and just trace back the whole line, and you can solve the problem with distributor. But I had this friend who had a problem with coil over plugs, each one individual plug, right? And the mechanic told him, you have to buy a new ECU. Yeah. So it becomes very complicated, and he got cheated lah. But luckily, I was there, and all I did was to clean up all the contacts, take out the ECU, clean up all the contacts, put it back, and the firing came proper. Or you just have to change. Sometimes the coils, are faulty, or you have so that's the issue with on plug.
Well, electronics in general, like corrosion is the enemy. Engine bay temperatures are the enemy. So once things get corroded, then the voltages are no longer correct. The computer gets confused. Things get very difficult. So yeah, keeping things clean and avoiding corrosion is key on the electronic systems. And arguably they are more sensitive. The connectors these days are much better at being sealed. They're much better designed so they don't get wet. But eventually,
we're not going to go into COP, right? So
coming back to maybe what you mentioned about cleaning, about the carburetor cleaner. What exactly am I cleaning?
Okay, well, you're cleaning the dirt out of the venturi. So carburetor cleaner is normally just a dangerous solvent, a solvent which probably doesn't meet environmental requirements, and you spray it. The fuel. Fuel is a pretty cheap thing. If you look at it from an industrial perspective, fuel is just the cheapest fractions out of a distillation process, which they can sell to the general public. So it's not pure octane; it's a whole mixture of anything they have, and it's not necessarily very clean. And so, as it's evaporating in the airstream, some of the garbage doesn't evaporate and stays in the carburetor, and that builds up and eventually causes trouble. And these solvents dissolve all that garbage and suck it through the engine and out the exhaust.
Is equally important. Because the air actually has a lot of tiny particles that get stuck on the side. So when you're cleaning the whole body and the whole passageway going in.
But with all these things, the Italian tune-up is also very powerful, right? So just get in your car and drive it hard on the highway. And actually, it's designed for that. And it surprisingly cleans up a lot, especially deposits on valves and in the induction system, cleans it up a lot, So it's not a old wives' tale. It really does make sense. If it's not running right and you've just been poodling around town for 6 months, get out on the highway, floor it for half an hour. It'll be much better. Yeah.
The term decarbonizing is...
Okay, so if you go back a long time, if you go back to the 1950s, my father talks about, even on a long journey, stopping at the side of the road removing the cylinder head, cleaning the head and the valves, putting it back on and continuing. So the carbon buildup on old engines was so bad that eventually they would choke themselves up and stop, and you would have to clean it up. Okay, modern fuels have got additives to try and stop that happening. But again, the best thing to do is just drive it hard, and all that stuff will go out the exhaust. Time up.
Just another point. Spark plugs, right? Also can cause power up. Yeah. So done this before. Just clean up the spark plugs and fire up straight away. So it can be as simple as that.
And one question: how often do you need to clean up the carburetor?
I wouldn't touch it until there's a reason to. So in terms of service, just change the air filter. Yeah. So I wouldn't really go in. On these SUs, you need to top up this dashpot. There's some oil in that tube in the top, so you need to make sure that the oil is topped up, and you need to make sure the air filter's in good condition. But other than that, I really wouldn't touch it. If you've got a petrol pump somewhere, you've got an inline filter of some form, you need to check that petrol filter's in good condition. But apart from that, I really wouldn't touch it. I'll go back to that American saying, it's a French word meaning do not touch, right? Leave the thing alone. Leave the thing alone.